Good morning, everyone. My name is Camara. I am a teaching assistant professor at the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I am very happy to virtually welcome you all to AAAD and to African Studies Center, which is the other institution co-sponsoring this event. It's a pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Andrea Frohne. I am even more excited because she was one of my former doctoral advisors from my alma mater, the School of Interdisciplinary Arts at Ohio University. So you can imagine how excited I am to be here. I'm also happy to be the co-host, or just the host of our first colloquium talk. And I look forward to a great conversation towards the end of the lecture. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. Dr. Andrea Frohne earned her Bachelor of Arts from Western Illinois University in English Literature, and then a Master's of Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD at Binghamton University in African Art History. She has taught at Cornell University, Pennsylvania State University, and Dickinson College. She is currently a professor of African Art History at Ohio University and serves as the director of the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and also as the interim director of the School of Arts and Design. She is the author of The African Burial Ground in New York City, which is the book she will be talking about today. And is also the co-editor of At the Crossroads, Readings of the Post-Colonial and the Global in African Literature and Visual Art. Her forthcoming book with Africa World Press is titled Contemporary Artists from the Horn of Africa: Encounters Beyond Borders Through Conflict, Colonialism, and Modernity. A quick housekeeping note before I hand the floor over to our speaker. Feel free to type in your questions, in the chat box during the talk. And then when the Q&A session begins, you'll get to it right then. Professor Frohne, the floor is yours. Thank you
so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction and for inviting me. It was an absolute pleasure to have Samba Camara as a PhD student, and it's just thrilling to see you as a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's really nice to see colleagues, Dr. McGee and Dr. Rovine, and I'm happy to meet everyone else, all of you on this call. And thank you, Ada, for organizing things. Okay, so I need to make this presentation mode. Okay, does that look good, Samba?
Yes.
Okay.
But you need to, so click on slideshow.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so it's bigger.
That good?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to do, I've really been thinking about the African burial ground in the contemporary moment, all that we've been going through as a nation. And so while memorials have been coming down, I thought about that in contrast to the incredible struggle and challenge that it was for memorials to be raised to commemorate the African burial ground from the 1990s into the 2000s and even up into 2010 into the 21st century. So I thought it would be interesting to think about where we are today in 2021 in the midst of Black Lives Matter, the death of George Floyd, and the monuments that have been changing around the world. And what is the context of all that in relation to my work on the African burial ground? So I'll just situate you all in New York City. This is the southern part of Manhattan, and you can see a square around the area that I'm talking about today. It covers 7 city blocks, and it was a communal cemetery that was used for 100 years, from about 1712 to 1795. And the yellow square shows you one block where the federal government built an office building. And so that's where the story begins in the late 20th century. So this is right by City Hall Park, just 10-minute walk up from where the World Trade Center was. And this is the office building that caused a lot of controversy in New York City because it was built on top of a portion of this communal cemetery. And a lot of research started as a result of this office building being built. And so we understand now that between 15,000 and 20,000 enslaved, freed Africans and people of African descent were buried in this communal cemetery. So it really changes our understanding of the slave trade in the United States and forces a rewriting and a re-envisioning of history that the institution of slavery occurred in the South and in the North, especially all of these ports, Boston, Rhode Island, New York. So this is the office building that was built on a portion of the African burial ground. Here's what it looks like just right next, the trees there are City Hall Park. So really, as you pass by, this is Broadway in Lower Manhattan, you don't have a sense that this is the African burial ground. And so there was a lot of grassroots struggle to get the building and the site recognized as a sacred site. So as I mentioned, I want to situate it in relation to our contemporary moment. And this is a photograph from last summer, from 2020, that's really loaded with politics. And I show you this photograph not to put us on different polarities in terms of our politics within this audience, but really to think about how the African burial ground is a part of this, what we're looking at in this photograph, and the histories that this photograph recall and speak to, and how it is that we have, this scene that happened in Richmond, and how this is such a politically charged image with a police officer standing above a monument that has been brought to the ground by June. The link at the top there is a Wikipedia link that is keeping track of all the monuments that have come down around the world. It details what the monument is, how it came down. And so there are over 190 entries in the US and elsewhere, but some major events were in Bristol, England, when Edward Colston was brought down. He was an 18th century slave trader, and that came down last summer. And it's also interesting that bringing down monuments brings histories to the fore within particular civic communities. And so I have cousins from Bristol who, then the history of who was Edward Colston, how did the wealth of Edward Colston build the city of Bristol? Those stories start to have a resurgence. Of course, before all of this happened, there have been movements to bring down monuments, such as Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, which started as a protest movement in 2015 about the Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town. So just really a rich, interesting history. I also wanted to foreground this talk with a really a text that I have really enjoyed working with. It's an exhibition that was in Berlin and Warsaw called After Year Zero, Geographies of Collaboration. And the co-curator, Anselm Franke, writes about this idea of, okay, we have these really difficult histories, and we always talk about them in terms of separate and in terms of conflict. But what about if we talk about them and think about them in terms of entanglement, and in terms of these moments of shared memories? And so I think that photograph of the fallen statue with the police officer is actually, rife with conflict, but also with shared memory for people of African descent and of European American descent in this nation. So we can think about shared memory as sort of going back to these points where a rift occurred. And the third set of text I have here, it says, to revisit the moments is to excavate, quote, arguably a memory that is painful, a memory that returns again and again to the scene of the crime. So I'm kind of taking us back in history and looking at some of these entangled histories. So here's an early print that we have showing, it's actually the only colonial image of New York City that I've been able to find that represents the Black body, that represents enslaved people. So out of all those numbers that I told you about in the communal cemetery, this is the one image in visual culture, aside from like generic maps that were not produced in New York. This print was a copper engraving that was made to entice Dutch settlement. So this was at the time that the Dutch had colonized what was then known as New Amsterdam. And so you see these two looming large Dutch figures holding their hands, welcoming you to this colony of New Amsterdam. But you also see labor. You see 4 enslaved Africans carrying tobacco, and you see that the way that they performed the labor, which was to carry the load on their head. And we know from excavations and scientific research at the African burial ground, a lot of people's neck bones are damaged as a result of labor. So in terms of the scarcity and the paucity of information directly about the African burial ground, these are 3 quotes that were made at the time that referred to the African burial ground. And even though the language is racist, it tells us some information about what was happening in terms of the funerals occurring in African languages and indigenous African practices. And also that these are the bottom 2 quotes are people from Trinity Church. And so their main concern is that the enslaved Africans were not Christian. And so they're commenting on that. But in their comments that the people were not Christian, we also are told that, again, indigenous funerary practices are being performed at night or sometimes all night long. So the Dutch brought some Africans, and then the British took over New York and the slave trade increased. By 1790, we have the 2nd largest population of enslaved Africans in the United States outside of South Carolina. Here's just a map showing you the flows from the coast of Africa, sometime, especially under the British, through the Caribbean into New York. And there's one arrow that's missing, which is Madagascar to New York. There were private citizens in New York who owned ships that were sailing with people from Madagascar to New York, which is a really, really long journey. Okay, so even though this building was built in the 1990s, it was, if you looked at the colonial documentation from the New York era, you would find that we know the African burial ground existed. So this is one example. It's a map from 1763 by Marschalk, and the detail of the map is here. The Negroes' burial ground, as it was then called, was on the outskirts of town along the Collect Pond. And some map makers acknowledged the presence of the Negro burial ground and others did not. So Marschalk is one of the people who did map it first in 1755 and then in 1763. So in point, it was actually being used at this time that he mapped it. And you can see the common, which to this day is still owned by the city. Back then it was owned by the city, and to this day it is City Hall Park. So I'll just introduce you to a few of the graves. The excavations began in the 1990s, and this is a map. This is a map of the underground world. It's called this particular type of map is called a stratigraphy, and it maps sometimes 3 layers deep where the coffins were buried, and so the analysis has been done on the coffins in relation to each other in order to determine possible family groupings, and also a periodization of the 18th century. So you can see the early group up to 1735, and then the late group covers the era of the American Revolution onwards. So the majority of the interred bodies and the number of interred bodies that were excavated in order to build the office building were 419. And so we don't know the names of any of the people who were buried. There were no names on and very few headstones. So we refer to them by the number in the order in which they were excavated. So here you're seeing a drawing of burial 147. The majority of the interred bodies were oriented to the west, wrapped in white shrouds and pinned with copper pins, and placed in wooden coffins without names. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a drawing of burial 147, who had a conjuring bundle pinned to the sleeve. He was a 55 to 65-year-old elder, and he had tiny copper rings wrapped in a cloth pinned to his arm, which you see pointed out in the drawing. He may have worn them in concealment while he was alive. He was one of the oldest of all the people who were excavated. As an elder, he would have amassed the power, wisdom, and experience to perform conjuring and healing for the community. Although a person of social and spiritual import, his body revealed a life of enslavement. His bones of his arms and his legs have scarring from infection or injury. His muscle attachments were enlarged from repeated stress, and he had arthritis in all of his major joint complexes and spine. The reason you are looking at this drawing is this is all we have of burial 147, because there was an in situ photograph that was taken of him, but it was stored in the World Trade Center laboratory, which was lost after September 11th. So we lost some primary photographs. This is an object that was recovered from burial 375. It's a ceramic ball that's covered with a copper band and then was kept in a cloth or leather. And it's very tiny, it's 17 millimeters diameter. So spheres or circular shapes were found in 4 graves total that could interpret African-based cosmologies. This particular grave, this particular object was found in a 16 to 18-year-old female that she wore, and she wore this in the little bag at her hip. And she was a teenager who had bone scarring in the lower limb as a result of inflammation from bacterial infection or an injury. And she had mild to severe arthritis throughout her body. And most of the people did have arthritis regardless of their age. And that's because their bodies were being worked just to such extremes under the labor. A lot of the graves are of children. And so this is burial 254. This child had this was a 3.5 to 5-year-old child who had a silver cast pendant that probably was worn at the neck. And she was buried right below another child who was 2 years of age. So they were possibly related. Silver, there are connections with silver and Native Americans, and there was a piece of silver jewelry from 1820 that was found in a Native American burial in Michigan. So it's a possible proposed connection that we don't know. This is a triple burial. It's an adult woman of 25 to 30 years old, and she is buried with 2 infants. They were in 3 separate coffins, but all within one grave. They were all buried at the same time, which means they died at the same time. And so what you're looking at here is in New York, a first generation of African Americans. These infants were born in New York. Sometimes we're able to tell from the adults whether they were born in New York or in Africa. The people who were born in Africa had extremely healthy teeth and extremely strong bones. There's malnutrition once the adults moved to New York and disease. And so that's one marker that the anthropologists found as they studied the bones. And all of these studies took place at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Okay, I'll show you one more. This detail of a grave is a result of violence. This is burial 25, and what you're looking at is a musket ball from a rifle in her rib cage. She was 20 to 24 years old, and she was 5 feet 1 inch tall. She was shot, but she did not die from being shot. She died. She was beaten and then later died. So her wounds had started to heal. The anthropologists were able to identify that. Sadly, she was also disturbed in death because when the office building was being built, she was truncated by a stone foundation that cut the burial in half, leaving her not in half, but cutting off her ankles and feet. And so we do see some urban destruction, either from the office building or from earlier urban development. So it was very controversial at the time, but there was DNA testing performed on 48 people. The General Services Administration would not allow any further DNA testing. However, Dr. William Blakey and other scientists were able to extract DNA, so wider testing could be performed in the future. This is the results of 48 people who were tested, and it shows, and this is in earlier, before our genetic testing pool. The pool was not as large, but it says people with DNA from Niger, from Benin, along the Gold Coast, Fulbe people, and then a lot of West and a lot of Central African. So when I did my research on the African burial ground, I often came across the slave codes and the laws about that. In New York, there were literally laws written against how funerals could be performed at this communal cemetery in New York. So I've started to think about the monitoring and the regulating of the Black body, because this then comes to form what evolves into the police force in the United States. So my preliminary research says that there are two main models for how the modern police force comes into existence in the US, and one is from these slave codes. What you're seeing here is an installation. If you go inside 290 Broadway, that's the building, that's the office building on top of a portion of the cemetery. They now have this little visitor center where you can experience some history of the site. And so this is one of the billboards that's in the visitor center. So one of the laws is in 1713. In 1712, there was an insurrection, an uprising that involved some people, enslaved people, and Africans and people of African descent. So in 1713, there was a law where you could not congregate at night. That's the one you see here. And it was a law for regulating Negroes and also Indians, that's like the specific language of 1713. In 1722, there was a law that ordered funerals for deceased Africans and Native Americans. The funerals had to occur during the day, in daylight, or before sunset. And if you held your funeral at night or after sunset, your penalty was 10 shillings, which the slave owner had to pay. In 1731, no more than 12 people could attend a funeral at the African burial ground. So, increasing control, especially under the British, to try to prevent any possibility. There was this fear of insurrection. So this is policing, right? This is the monitoring of the Black body that gets gets root in the slave patrols that are made up of white volunteers that are this regulation that's occurring in relation to slavery, and that is always this kind of backlash against various uprisings that occur. So the first slave patrols, as they were termed, began in South Carolina in the early 1700s. And the other, I mentioned there's two strains that have influenced our modern police force, and the other strain is based on Britain and how the police force was being formed in Britain. So those two strains came together to become the police force that we have today in the United States. So there was a lot of, I will skip over this in the interest of time, but it's really interesting to see how the African burial ground was mapped in colonial New York. And it was mapped as the land was covered up towards the end of the 18th century. So these are the lots of land that are being divided up and being sold. The northern half went first. And so you see that the boundary of the cemetery is actually used to mark real estate in this survey map. At the bottom, it says Negroes Burying Ground. So the southern half is still being used in 1787. And then I found this really wild drawing in the New York Public Library where there were all kinds of disputes about who gets which lot of land and who inherits what. And so this is an attempt to try to figure it out. But what you see in this is an absence. The Negroes Burying Ground is not mapped because it is now divided up by the city and being either sold off or given off to people who were claiming inheritance. And the left is Broadway, the left broad and then way that you see there. All right, so we skip now to 1990, 1991, 1992. The General Services Administration identifies a plot of land, purchases it from the city, and builds an office building. All along, you have to do your salvage archaeological research, and you see that there was a Negro cemetery in the 18th century, but it was inferred that urban development had already destroyed the cemetery, and no, there was not going to be anything there. So prior to any construction, there was testing, and bones were being identified and remains were being identified. So what you see here is an archaeological team working at 290 Broadway. And I'll just show you some more photographs. So the foundation of the building is occurring simultaneously with excavation of the bones that are happening inside of the white tent. So it was tried to keep this away from the community because there was a timeline for building the building. However, it was really the newspaper reporters who just were constantly at the site writing about mistakes that were happening and bones that were getting damaged, which drew grassroots activism to the site and increasing awareness about what was going on during this time. So to add to the controversy, the first archaeological team that was hired did not have experience in working with cemeteries. It did not have experience with African-American sites. And the photographs that we were seeing showed primarily people of European American descent. So it was really a lot of anger was increasing at how history was being researched and handled, and how would and what would happen with that research. So eventually there was a lot of government agencies at the local level, the regional, the state, and the federal, all getting in touch with each other, and a lot of activism happening in the 1990s. And eventually the site was shut down. A new archaeological team was brought on who had experience working with African-American sites. The John Milner company from Philadelphia was brought on, and a research plan was put in place. And so things moved forward from there. My PowerPoint is not, there we go. So I started my research, attending hearings, listening to people, really, ask how is this cemetery going to be acknowledged? How is it going to be recognized in Lower Manhattan? We're walking on these graves, 6 to 7 city blocks. So I attended lots of open houses and demonstrations and hearings, and took photographs like these two really important grassroots leaders, Adunia Shupa Tabasi and Miss Louise Dix. This is a reverend from Brooklyn who attended lots of events and gave a very important talk. So all of these things were being hashed out and being wrestled with, and there were a lot of challenges to the General Services Administration. So eventually, different amounts of money were allocated to have different memorials and commemorative artworks made that would go inside of the office building. And to this day, you can still go inside of the office building and see these artworks. There was a after the research was finished, there was a reburial of the remains. And that was a really wonderful multi-state event where the remains traveled on the water up the coast from DC into New York. And we see different events. And so my interest is, how is the cemetery memorialized without an actual artwork yet at this point, without a physical commemorative marker. So this is one example where there's a libation ceremony in Jersey City. Another example is Congo Square in Philadelphia. And then I also track offerings that are left at the site and took photographs of those. This is an artwork inside the lobby, and the artists were brought and a libation was performed by a Haitian priestess. So I try to capture these moments of spirituality where African identity and African arts also are recognized in relation to all the conflict and the challenges that are going on. Oh, here's some photographs of the offerings that I took. Then this is the all-night burial, the all-night vigil. The coffins were handmade in Ghana. They're very small after the remains had been researched. And then there are adinkra outside of each of carved into the coffins. And people brought like water bottles for libation and wrote messages to the dead, left flowers. All of those were reburied with the coffins. School children came to South Street Seaport. Thousands of them came as the remains ceremoniously docked. And this was also the port where the slave trade occurred in the colonial New York era. And then half of Broadway was blocked off, and there was a procession with the remains. And then they're unloaded at 290 Broadway to prepare for the burial. So this takes us to Foley Square, which is right next to 290 Broadway. And this is where the funerary ceremony happened with Amadou Diallo's mother and the Harlem Boys Choir in performances. But what you see there is Lorenzo Pace's Triumph of the Human Spirit, which is, here's a performance. So I'll just briefly touch on this artwork. This is the Triumph of the Human Spirit that's made of black granite. And I like it because you can go up to it, you can sit on it, you can engage with the piece. It's not a controlled space. And it's based on Chiwara, Bamana, antelope headdress that Lorenzo Pace was inspired to base his piece on when he was going through the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So when I was doing my research, I kept waiting for the artwork to open so I could write it into my research. And it was wrapped up like this for months. And so I was taking photographs of the wrapped up piece of the monument. And I was, I could never find out, like, when should I go to New York City for the unveiling, for like the official, here's the monument. It honors the diaspora, it honors Native Americans, and it honors the people of the African burial ground. So then I finally went and it was open. I was like, how did I miss that? So what I found out was that one agency organized the official unveiling on a particular day, which happened to be Columbus Day. And Lorenzo Pace was not going to attend an unveiling of his sculpture that would honor Columbus. No school, lots of people could go. And he boycotted his own opening. He did not attend. This is the artist. who didn't attend. And the government agent said, this is unbelievable. How could you not attend? Because it's Columbus. Columbus is part of the U.S. history. So that was right at the turn of the 21st century. I think we've kind of thought through Columbus a little bit since then. Columbus is still, there's still a lot of struggle around that. Nevertheless, Lorenzo Pace organized his own opening with Amiri Baraka and the people that he chose to invite, which I didn't know about. So I don't have photographs of that event, but I think the story then of trying to get this memorial raised, and then sort of a failure of raising that memorial and sort of this rescheduling and rewriting through the grassroots is a part of memorials. And when we look at memorials, they represent a collectivity that at some point does exclude. It can't be 100% inclusive ever. And so what are those marginalities that we want to consider? And I'll just close with this final monument that took a really long time to raise. And I write about how the struggles of that in this book that Carol McGee co-edited. I have a chapter in the African Art Interviews Narratives, where there were lots of stops and starts, and now you can visit this memorial, and it's very successful. The Parks Department runs it. They're very well informed, and they give really good tours, which I was worried, how is this going to end up? But this is where if you walk behind the office building, you now can go to this monument, and the Parks Department runs the Statue of Liberty. They run these really major sites. And so now the African Burial Ground is a part of this national agency. So there are Veve, Haitian Veve, and different spiritual symbols around the walls of the monument. This was designed by Rodney Léon, an architect of Haitian American descent. And I really like the bottom of the memorial because it puts Africa in the center. It reorganizes the world map. And so Africa, and then these radiating circles, these radiating lines speak to diasporas from the continent of Africa, whether forced or whether voluntary. And then there's lots of school groups that come and get tours from the rangers, the park rangers. So in order for this monument to become a part of in order for it to become a national monument, what had to happen was the President of the United States has to make a proclamation. And so that happened in 2006. We have this proclamation from George W. Bush, and then the plans could go forward to get the monument incorporated as part of the Parks Department. And it's really interesting. Finally, in 2006, the Secretary of the Interior has to make a speech at the site where the African burial ground is not marginalized, but is incorporated into the body politic as a part of the nation. And I highlighted the word nation in all the different places that Gail Norton talks about this site that had undergone so much struggle and challenge. And Maya Angelou was invited to read a poem at the site. And so instead of shunning African and African-American identity as part of New York's civic identity, federal government officials had reached a point where they embraced and accepted the African burial ground on a national level. The community activism has resulted in the official recognition of many populations in New York. So here's the signage and the monument. It actually goes down It's not tall, but it goes down to meet the ancestors who are 25 feet below ground. So not all of them were excavated because the site was shut down. So there are some people still buried there. This narrative, I'll just conclude, this narrativizing of memory is far from static. During all of the open hours at this monument, and a national park ranger stays on the site giving well-informed tours and answering questions. Rather than reading fixed text on a sign, visitors interact with different rangers each time they visit. Knowledge and narrative are recuperated from the past and produced in the present. The monument at the burial ground came into existence through politics, tensions, and controversies over race, space, national identity, and power in an effort to honor the dead. In recalling and reclaiming Africa, commemoration, narrative, and memory at the African burial ground are continually in process and production. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Andrea Frohne, for the great talk. And again, if you wouldn't mind, I think it would be nice to just unmute your mics and make some noise for Professor Andrea Frohne. Please go ahead and do just that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So now is the time to ask any questions or make any comments. I think we have
There's a question in the chat box, Zamba.
right,
Two
right.
questions now, actually.
Okay, so I see a comments of thank yous. Let's see. There's a question from Bryce Jones. Do you consider the physical/spiritual space in the ABG, African burial ground, that you talk about in the book as a relative form of rebellion against the controlling aspects of slavery in New York? That is our first question to our speaker.
Do I consider the physical spiritual space in the burial ground as a relative form of rebellion? As a form of rebellion in the colonial era at the time that it was being used? No, if you're asking about it in that era, I would not see that as a form of rebellion. You know, I would see that as day-to-day life. When your loved ones die, you need to honor them, and you go to your identity, you go to your culture, you go to what you know. And so I see it more as a part of everyday life and as a need. So I didn't actually show you this, but Trinity Church in 1697 made a proclamation that no more Negroes could be buried in the churchyard, which makes me wonder if some are buried there. But anyway, they made this proclamation. And so the cemetery started in the swampy area along Collect Pond. And you saw in the map that Collect Pond was way outside of the city. So it was this marginalized space. Nobody really wanted it. It wasn't good real estate. You couldn't build on it. So that actually saved and protected the development of the space and allowed it to develop into 6 to 7 city blocks, because it was just this marshy place that couldn't be built on. It was actually down in a valley, which is why it's there was 25 feet of fill that was put on top of it to flatten Manhattan in 1800. And so that's why we do have these remains still in existence. So that would be my way of thinking about that, Bryce.
Great. Professor Andrea Frohne, I assigned this book in one of my classes, which is Global Black Rural Culture. It's a class that I came up with to really try to navigate, of course, me and my students, to navigate the spaces of Black self-representation and Black self-narration through various processes of artistic and cultural production in the Black Atlantic. So that's really what I do. And I use this book to specifically talk about how Africa has symbolically been brought into these struggles in the US, these Afro-diasporic struggles that sort of shape eventually the identity of the African-American subject. So one thing that I see is that your book does, and which actually the African Burial Ground does, and which is very unique to it, is that it is able to give to traditional African art, and I do not mean modern African art, I mean traditional African art, a second spiritual life, which is something that is uncommon because art has been leaving Africa either as colonial booty, right? Recently, a colleague of mine who just came here at Duke wrote a report under the guidance of the French president to ask Africans to, what do you want to get back from that colonial loot? So whenever traditional African art leaves the continent, either as colonial booty or if it lands in the art black market, you know, it loses its what I call indigenous integrity. And by that, I mean just it loses its spiritual integrity, because traditional African art is produced ritually. It is produced and used and consumed performatively. So if you separate one object out of the whole of it, you kill it. And that's what has happened in African art objects that have been relocated colonially, of course, during Europe. But the African burial ground, I think one thing that it has done, or at least its commemorative artworks has done, is to infuse or to re-spiritualize, if you will, traditional African art in a way that really gives it a second life, in the same way that African Americans are negotiating self-representation and diasporic identities by building on the layers of identities that preceded, you know, the 17th century, which is 1619, if you will. So I just wanted to comment and say that your book does really use a convincing language, specifically the concept of the spirituality of the space, you know, to sort of analyze how those processes of diasporic self-representation occur. Now, the question that I had was, yeah, I mean, the African burial ground now, it is a national monument. It is managed by the National Park Services, which means that I can't just walk in and start my libation to commemorate. So, and I feel I'm tempted to say that there may be some friction or conflict, right, between the traditional ways of commemorating and the ways in which the burial ground is policed today. So how does the NPS make it possible or not for us to really do what the African burial ground is supposed to do? The commemorative works are supposed to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samba. I love the re-spiritualize idea. I love that. That's great. Okay, so you brought up lots and lots of things, and I'm super excited that your class is reading this. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, the libations, that was always for me an issue, to be able to engage the space or not engage the space. And to this day, you can still walk to the Trinity Church graveyard and pour your life, you know, if you wanted to, you could. Right, so you cannot at the African burial ground. Of course, anywhere on those 6 to 7 acres, any sidewalk, any place you want, you can certainly pour a libation. But there is, I agree with you, this incredible tension of this official collective memorial that is controlled with a particular type of urban aesthetic where you cannot leave an offering. And I do compare that to early moments of the ground zero, where people were writing messages, leaving flowers all over the city. And that also slowly you see signs going up, please don't write on this. Please, any object you leave will be removed. I have photographs of those. So I agree that now the one place that I'm quite interested in is the Vietnam War Memorial, where consistently over so many years, people continue to leave objects that now at the end of each day, the objects are taken and cataloged and put in a repository and preserved. So it's a different kind of engagement of space, but it is acknowledged that the space needs to be engaged. And by the way, Myelin is from Athens, Ohio, right here where I'm giving the talk. Yeah. So Jordan Cuffey and Tatum Sabota ask, how did I get to this topic? So if you all want the real story, it was through a dream. I knew that I needed to find something to work on that would be dynamic and inspiring, or I would not get my degree done. So I was on the lookout for that. I traveled across West Africa on the lookout for that. Came to school in Binghamton, still looking, and then I picked up a brochure in the Guggenheim Museum that had a little thing about a little photograph of one of the skeletons. I was like, oh my goodness, what is this? I had a dream about missing a bus to New York City. I kept missing the bus. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get on the bus and see what happens. I had some free time. And I got the project. And I just, I've had questions about me as a white person or a person of European American descent working on this. And it goes back to that answer about entanglement, that we are, like, the African burial ground, relates to us all over the world in some way or another, because people from so many parts of the world, lived in those different parts of the world and were brought forcibly to New York City. And then we move across those city streets. And so how are those monuments, how are those commemorative artworks going to reflect a public? Which public are they recognizing? And that was really a huge battle at the late 20th century, early 21st century, that grassroots activists were involved with.
Fantastic. Great. And I think it's almost time, but I think we saw a hand from Professor Pyer. If you still want to ask your question, and then we'll take that as a last.
Then just let me answer Chris Williams about Seneca Village. So that is a really interesting separate historical question, and research needs to be done to link those two, but thank you. Yeah, Professor Pyer. Still muted.
You're muted.
Hi, my name's Dave Peer. I have two quick questions about the current memorialization. First is those symbols that are ringing. I wonder if you know what exactly the origin of those symbols might be. Then the other question I had, this sort of relates to our current campus, where we have a memorial to the unsung founders. And one of the complaints that's been raised about that memorial is that people have their lunch on it and just sort of casually use it without really thinking about what its meanings may be. So I was wondering if similar complaints have been raised about people, as you said, sitting on it, et cetera.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's one of the questions about memorials, isn't it? Do you engage it as sacred space, or do you or do you engage it? You know, you eat on it, you talk, you chit chat. So Lorenzo Pace wants people to sit at the Chihuahua and really, you know, let that seep into your life. And actually it's right there outside the Supreme Court. So you probably see shots of that in Blue Bloods and different television shows, Law and Order. So yeah, I mean, I would think that's more of a personal take on how you want a sculpture to be engaged. But which symbol are you asking about? Is it one of these? No, you're still on mute.
They rushed past. My first thought is oh my goodness, those are Bunseki's like cosmogram symbols. But now that you're showing them a little longer, they look like sort of a mix of different things. And I was just wondering where he got them, whether you've done any research into the provenance of these symbols.
Yeah, thank you. They are supposed to be worldwide, different, often, many are spiritual symbols, but not all of them. Many of them are Insibiti, Adinkra, African ones, but then some are more, I think, Native American, Islam, and also diasporic Cuban and Haitian. So yeah, but yes, research. I have like the description of the artwork that enumerates each of them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrea Frohne, and to our attendees. It's been a wonderful talk. I wanted to thank very much UNC's African Studies Center for its continued support and co-sponsorship of our department's events, including these ones that cut across continental Africa and the US. So these are very, very important. Thank you again, Ada, for your work and everything. Thank you, Professor. We will catch up later.
Thank you, Dr. Camara. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.